people out with their problems, feeding hungry animals, or helping trees and flowers to bloom after they've wilted will net you a lot of praise, and trust me, you'll want to do as much as you can. And then, of course, there is the most unique and indeed most used mechanic in the entire game, the ability to manipulate the environment around you through use of the Celestial Brush. Throughout the entire game, you will receive more and more constellations, and the more of these constellations you accrue, the more brush powers you receive. Each brush power is unique and allows you to use a special power, such as cutting an enemy in half or cutting down obstacles, manipulating the flow of water, causing a gust of wind to fly everywhere, and so on and so forth. Many of these powers are used quite often in the entire game. Though some of them are used only in specific situations, most of them have several different uses, and you will have to experiment with them in order to figure out just where you can use each of the particular abilities, such as the Cherry Bomb, for example. It's useful for more than just blowing up walls, but you have to experiment with it to figure out what its other uses could be. Combat in the game is also pretty unique. When you enter combat, you'll be in a walled-off, spiritually sealed area with a bunch of different enemies. And when you fight them, you fight with one of three different weapons. The shield, which is your standard weapon, the rosary, which acts like a ranged whip, but generally won't stun the enemies that often, and the sword, which is powerful but requires you to get in close, and also has the disadvantage of being a very slow weapon. You can also use the Celestial Brush as a weapon, and that turns the enemies into puzzles themselves, as many of the enemies have a weakness to one or more of the brush powers, but you'll have to do some experimentation to figure out which one will harm the enemy more, or make them most vulnerable to your ordinary attacks. While this was a clever way of keeping combat from turning into just a button-mashing extravaganza, it does present a bit of a problem in terms of difficulty. Once you know an enemy's weakness, they almost become too easy on subsequent fights, and you never find yourself worrying about whether or not you'll be able to face this enemy, because you know you'll be able to take them down because of the specific brush technique you have. Now, the game does have a few flaws, and this is where one of them comes to a head. The game really isn't that difficult. It's long, it's not a game you can clear in just a few sittings, but it doesn't really pose a challenge if you're meticulous about it. Now, there are plenty of places in this game where you can get hung up, especially when you're looking for information on where to go next. But if that happens, it's pretty much just a situation where you need to consider if you've talked to everybody possible and whether or not you've explored an area to its fullest potential and found all the places where you can use your Celestial Brush. Combat, like I said, is very easy once you've figured out a specific enemy's particular weaknesses. And the puzzles in this game are dead simple, which is extremely disappointing. While the game does get more difficult over time, it never gets so difficult that it ever really challenges the player. Add to it that Isun, being the little ass that he is, will practically hand you the solutions to some of these puzzles, especially when it's a puzzle that I could have figured out on my own had the game given me an opportunity to do it. The fact that the game is so bent on holding your hand just really bothers me, and it really takes me out of the experience. But that may be debatable. Now, some people might dispute me about the game's difficulty, but for me personally, I just didn't find the game much of a challenge. The only time I had any sort of problems with the game, in terms of difficulty, was at the very end in the last dungeon during the final boss. That was it. So, instead of arguing, let's just move on to something we can all agree on. The graphics are awesome. The entire game is made to resemble a calligraphy drawing, and of course this makes sense considering that your main power is, of course, based entirely on calligraphy. Everything has a thick black outline surrounding it, and it just pops off of the screen as if it were part of an expert artist's canvas. I can't praise the graphics highly enough here. Everything just feels so cartoony, yet so genuinely realistic. It's the type of thing that I would describe more of as an experience rather than just a game. Every character's movements and expressions are very exaggerated but very smooth, and the environments that you interact with feel wonderfully lifelike yet extremely colorful. I can also safely say that this game is just as easy on the ears as it is on the eyes. All of the music in the game feels extremely appropriate, and most importantly, it's pleasing to listen to. It could almost be considered a period piece, since every single one of the songs actually feels like it's from the time period that the game is taking place in, using things like flutes, soft string instruments, and a very concussive drum beat. I mean, just listen to a few of these and you'll get the idea. So beautiful. Anyway, with all of these things taken into consideration, it's very difficult to see why the game failed. I've tried doing research on it, but nobody can seem to give me a concrete answer as to why this game didn't sell very well. People have thrown out theories like maybe the advertisements weren't strong enough, or maybe the developers just didn't push the game hard enough, but that's entirely false. I was seeing advertisements and gameplay videos for this game as early as 2004. With that in mind, I really have to question just why? This is a fantastic game. True, it's not perfect, but nothing is. This is a game that really demonstrates what the PlayStation 2 is capable of, and really makes a statement about games as a visual art medium. Thankfully, though, the game has become much more popular in recent years. A Wii port of the original PS2 game not only scored almost as high in reviews with critics as the original Okami did, but also sold much better, and a direct sequel to the original game, called Okami was just released for the DS in Japan and is slated for a North American release later on in 2011. So here's hoping we'll be seeing more of Amaterasu and her friends in the near future. And so with that happy fact in mind, it's time for us to end this review. This game gets a definite must-play from me, and if you get a chance to check it out, whether it be on its PS2 format, the new Wii port, or if you just want to pick up the new Okami game for the DS when it comes out later on, I highly recommend any of them. So long as you are playing these games, it doesn't matter. These are fantastic games, and honestly, they should be experienced by everyone. But you know, this was a game that was made in Japan, very heavily influenced by Japanese people. Next time, I think we'll take a look at something that was made by Americans in America that has a lot of Chinese people in it. Wait.
Some say the devil is dead, the devil is dead, the devil is dead. Some say the devil is dead and buried in Killarney. More say he rose again, more say he rose again, more say he rose again and joined the British Army.